Good morning. There's about 800 pens on this lectern. What's going on here? It's really good to be with you all. Those of us that aren't on holiday here together. I'm actually going to Costa del Glasgow for my holiday in a couple of weeks' time, so I hope your summer plans are more exciting than that. But yeah, it's great to be with you. It's great to be able to close the series that we've been working through on the book of Daniel. And just to be able to share thoughts from the Bible is such a privilege. Now, I listened to a sermon the other day, and the guy held up his Bible at the start, and he said, "This is my Bible. I am who it says I am. I have what it says I have. I can do what it says I can do." And I thought that was awesome. What a way to start. Why don't we just quickly pray together? Lord, we thank you for your word. Father, we thank you for just the wisdom, the gold, the life that sits within the pages of this Bible, Lord. And I pray this morning as we explore it together, Father, you would teach us new things, you would show us your heart, Lord, and you would bring us closer to who you want us to be in you, Lord. Amen. So I'm going to quickly read, I say quickly, it's quite long. I'm going to read through chapter 5 of Daniel because I think it's a chapter that you kind of need to hear all of to understand what's going on. So it's going to come up on the screen behind me as well, but we're going to read from the NIV version, the whole of chapter 5. It says, "King Belteshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While he was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the goblets that had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood and stone. Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote, and his face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. The king called out for the enchanters, the astrologers, and the diviners of Babylon. 'Whoever reads this writing and tells me what this means will be clothed in purple and will have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom.' Then all of the king's wise men came in, but they couldn't read the writing. So King Belteshazzar became even more terrified. His face grew pale even still. His nobles were baffled. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and the nobles, came into the banquet hall. 'O king, live forever,' she said. 'Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, I say, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. This man Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge, understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means.' So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, 'Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me now what it means, but they could not. Now that I've heard you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems, if you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom.' Then Daniel answered the king, 'You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and nations and men of every language dreamed and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched in the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and set over anyone he wishes. But you, his son, O Belteshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the God of heaven. You had the goblets of his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles and wives and concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, of iron, of wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds you in his hand and holds your life and all of your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is what was written. Mene, mene, tekel parsin. This is what those words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then at Belteshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at aged 62. Thanks for bearing with me as we got through that. But I think it is important that we hear that whole chapter if we're going to understand what it means. And the thing about the Bible is that you can read a chapter like that, and you can take it all in at a surface level, and you can think, what is the relevance for me? Like, what is it in there that really applies to my life? Because at face value here, we've got an ancient king sat in his banquet hall, surrounded by thousands of nobles and wives and concubines, drinking, partying, and actually blaspheming against God by drinking from the goblets that were stolen from the temple previously. And he gets his comeuppance. And we can understand probably that far, but apart from that, trying to understand what the relevance is in what happened with King Belshazzar and what's happening in our lives right now is not immediately obvious, necessarily. As far as I'm aware, there are no kings in the room, apart from those that conveniently carry the surname, but there's no royalty in this room. No one in this room is likely to find ourselves in that place, with a banquet of thousands of nobles and an army at the gates. So the right question to ask is, why did God see fit that this historical event would be recorded in his Bible? And what does it actually mean for me and my life? And I think for us to understand that, we first need to understand some of the history of what is going on at this time. And so if you've been here over the previous weeks, you'll know we've been studying the book of Daniel, and we've heard a fair bit about King Nebuchadnezzar over recent weeks. And in this chapter, we're obviously introduced to another king of Babylon, King Belshazzar, who is referred to as Nebuchadnezzar's son, but he's actually not his son. And we know that from history because there were 4 kings that served between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. He might be his grandson, that is possible, but it's actually more likely that he was just a descendant, but referred to in that way. But we know that actually there were 4 kings that served before, and if you remember from Dave's sermon, if you were here at the very beginning of this series, you'll remember he talked about the fact that Nebuchadnezzar was viewed as the greatest king in the Babylonian era. So he oversaw a period of military success. He was a powerful warrior king, but he also oversaw a period of architectural success where Babylon was built into one of the most splendid cities in the ancient world. He was also viewed as a king that oversaw a period of 43 years when he reigned, where there was, within the walls of Babylon, real peace and prosperity. So he was seen as the greatest king. But since he had died, the throne had been a treacherous place in Babylon. So his actual son, Merodach, succeeded him on the throne, and he was hated by the people. He was actually referred to as Evil Merodach, which is quite sinister, but that's what they called him, Evil Merodach, and he was actually murdered by his own brother 2 years into his reign. He was then succeeded by a king who only lasted 4 years before he died. He was then succeeded by a king who was actually a child, not of sound mind, who was beaten to death by a group of conspirators. And one of those conspirators was Nabonidus, who took on the throne. And it was he who appointed Belshazzar as co-regent, so co-king essentially with him, of Babylon at this time. So it's been a treacherous period over the leadership of Babylon. The other historical context that is really important here is that Babylon at this point is under serious threat from a powerful enemy in the Persians and the Medes. So Cyrus the Great had unified the various chiefs of Persia. He'd conquered Median, and now this combined powerful force of the Medes and the Persians were descending on Babylon's gates. And yet with all that in mind, the treacherous nature of the throne, the enemy at the gates, we find Belshazzar here hosting a party. Sat in his banquet hall, drinking, partying, defiling the cups that were stolen from the temple. which tells you a little bit about the guy, that he could be in that mindset despite everything else that was going on. And the name Belshazzar actually means Bel, which was another word for the Babylonian god of creation, Marduk. So Bel or Marduk has protected the king, is what his name means. And you can tell he's a guy who's living in that sense of security. I'm protected by the gods. But the other thing we need to know about Babylon is that Babylon at this time as a city was near impenetrable from a military perspective. So the walls on the outside of Babylon were 17 miles long, and they were 90 feet tall, so like a 10-story building. On top of those walls, you had 100-foot guard towers, so the best part of 200 feet was the height of the outer walls. Inside, if you somehow managed to scale those walls, which no one could, you would find another series of internal walls protecting the city. And then if you managed to get through that as well, you came to the real security of Babylon, which were deep trenches of water, deep moats of water that actually flowed in from the Euphrates River, and they were impossible for an army to cross. So if your army could get over the 100-foot walls, escape the extra 100-foot guard towers, get through the internal walls, you were still met by a sea of water between you and the city. And this is the real reason that despite everything else that's going on, Belshazzar could sit in his banquet hall quite comfortably while the enemy was at the gates. And that is why he felt confident enough even to mock God, the real and living God, in his conduct at that party. And so the big question that I want us to all consider this morning in our lives is, where do we find our security? Where does our safety come from in our lives? Because we now know where Belshazzar's came from. It came from his gods of wood and stone and gold and others, and it came from his moats and his walls. But where do we find our security? If today everything in our life fell apart and everything that was important to us crumbled, what would be left behind as our safety net? Because what we see here is that something amazing happens in the midst of this party that Belshazzar is throwing. This hand appears and starts to write on the wall. Fun fact, by the way, the saying "the writing is on the wall" descends from this very event. So for any of you Stevie Wonder fans out there, you can use that at your next pub quiz. But we see in this moment, when something amazing happens in the midst of that party, how quickly the king's security falls away. Despite his moats and his walls and his gods, when he sees this hand writing on the wall, we're told that he turns pale. He starts to shake. His knees give way. And in a similar pattern to earlier chapters, the magicians, the astrologers of the day are useless. They aren't able to interpret what's going on. And so they turn to the same man again, the man of God, the man of the very God they were just mocking with their goblets. Daniel is called to come and help them understand the situation. And Daniel, by this point, by the way, is about 90 years old. And I imagine getting pretty sick of Babylonian kings at this point. But he's called in and he tells them to keep their gifts for themselves, but he does interpret what's written on the wall. And the key takeaways there are, just like his descendant, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar has become hardened with pride. And unlike Nebuchadnezzar, who, as we read in that chapter, was previously sent insane by God for 7 years to roam the wilderness and to eat like a beast before he humbled himself and turned his attention back to God. But unlike him, and even in the knowledge of what he had done and who he had turned to in that time, Belshazzar had ignored it and continued to act in pride. And we know because of that, he'd set himself up against God by honoring things and honoring gods that were not real. And we know that therefore he was weighed. That word tekel, it literally meant to weigh on the scales. He was weighed on the scales by God and found to be wanting. And then we also know by what happened to him at the end that the whole time it was God and God alone who was in charge of not just who sat on the throne of Babylon, but on who would own that kingdom moving forwards too. So that's all of the historical context that we need to understand, I think, to really get a sense of what this means for us. And so it then pulls us back to that question of, like, what does it actually mean for me in the context of where I find my security? And what does it mean for me in the context of this whole series we've been working through on living a life without compromise? And I think there are 3 quick things that we should pull out of that. The first is that we have to ask ourselves how firm the foundation of our life really is. What sort of footing are we on? You know, Jesus told a story once, a parable about 2 men that built houses. One built his house on the sand, and then when the rains came and the winds came, the foundations gave way and the house collapsed. But another man built his house on solid rock, and when the rains came and the winds came, it stood firm against the elements. And in this chapter, Belshazzar believes that he is built on solid ground. He really believes that he's built on something that cannot be penetrated. But the great irony for Belshazzar was that obviously his gods were powerless, and we know that. But the other real irony is he'd put so much faith in his walls and his moats, and actually it was the waters in his moats that betrayed him in the end. So the way that the Persian Mede army got into Babylon that night is they very cleverly dug hundreds of trenches along the Euphrates River to drain water away from the river and away from Babylon so that the water level would fall low enough that an army could simply just walk through into the city. And so this thing that he had built his entire foundation on was the actual thing that betrayed him and led him to ruin. And that's something we have to learn, is that when we build our lives on anything that is not the rock-solid foundation of the real and living God, we leave ourselves open to undoing. And if we build our lives on anything but God, we are living a life that's not uncompromised, it is compromised. The second thing that we see from this passage is that God, when he looks at us, is uncompromising in his pursuit of our hearts. You know, in the Bible, God is referred to in a number of places as a jealous God, which, sounds like a negative thing in modern language. But actually, the first place we read it is in Genesis 20, and the original Hebrew word there is quana, which is a word that is specifically reserved for the jealousy of God. So it is not a spiteful jealousy, it is not a hateful jealousy in the way that we might know it, but it is a jealousy that basically refers to just a desperate desire to have exclusive relationship with us. That is God's heart for us. He wants nothing to do with second place. He wants to be the priority in our life. It's a special feeling to be pursued. Those of you young enough to maybe be dating, you might be experiencing this in your life right now. It was a while ago for me, unfortunately. But that feeling of being pursued, that feeling of being on someone's mind all the time, that feeling of being someone that when that person isn't where you are, they want to be where you are, it is a really special feeling. And what we learn from this passage is that is God's desire for us. His desire is that we would be with each other all the time. That wherever we go, he goes. That whatever we do, he's in it. And he won't accept anything that isn't that. And the third thing that I think we have to take from this passage is that we are not in control of our lives. That is the thing we see from Belshazzar. He's got all of this security, all of this protection. He believes he's protected even by the gods. And yet what we see by the end is he was actually in no control whatsoever around what happened in his life. And I think the reason that we fall into the trap of making earthly things our security is because we believe that we have an element of control around them. So like, if I can meet that perfect partner, if I can live in that perfect house, if I can earn that amount of money, if I can be friends with those people, if I can be perceived to be this person, then I'll be safe and I'll be secure. William Henry wrote quite a famous poem called Invictus, and the final line of that poem is, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." And stirring and inspirational as that might be, what we see from the story of Belshazzar is that it's totally untrue. We are not in control of what happens. And actually in life, the only real security comes in the knowledge that even if everything else falls away, even if all of our earthly security disappears, even if all the people that love us fail us, even if everything we hold in our hand dissolves, that we will always have the love of God to fall back on as our rock-solid security. That is what life without compromise looks like. And that is what safety and security really means. And as I come towards the end, I just want to share a quick personal story in that I've recently just left a job that I've been in for 12 years. I joined this company at 21 years old, way before I met my wife, way before I had children. I feel like I've spent my entire adult life in this company. And it's been an amazing job for me, and it's been an incredibly secure job for me for a long time. Even in tougher economies, I've been looked after, I've been cared for. And if I'm being really honest, for the best part of 12 years, I've never had to worry about the finances in our life, which is an amazing place to have been in, because that blessing of that job has been there, and it's been a real security. And now I'm in this season of believing that God is moving me into something else, but not fully knowing what that next thing is yet. And that for me is a very unusual feeling. And I've had some mornings over the last few weeks where I've woken up and the anxiety starts to hit. And you think, what have I done here? Like, have I done the right thing? What if I don't get another job? What if I have to move my family out of the house that we only moved into like 8 months ago because I can't afford the mortgage anymore? What if I fail at whatever I do next? I've had mornings where that anxiety has really been on my heart. And what it's shown me is just how much security I have put over the last 12 years in that job. But I tell you what it's really shown me. It's really shown me just how phenomenally grateful I am that that isn't the cornerstone of my life. And that on those mornings when the fear comes and the anxiety strikes, that I know I can kneel once again before the King of Kings, the living God, and say, actually, whatever happens, you are my security. You have never failed me. You know what's happening. I am not the master of my fate. I am not the captain of my soul. And I am so unbelievably grateful for that. And that main question is one that I think we all have to consider today. Where do we actually find security in our lives? And the really tough question is, if God weighed us like he did with Belshazzar, if he weighed where the priorities were, if he weighed what the thing was that we were building everything else on top of in our lives today, what would it really be? Would it be God? Or would it be something else? I wonder if the prayer team, the worship team would just come back up at this point. And in a moment, the prayer team will be available. And if you come here regularly, you'll know they're generally at the sides of the room here and would love to pray with you, to speak with you. And I had a really strong sense as I was preparing for this morning that there are people here today who know that they have built their lives on something that has proven not to be a solid foundation. Perhaps that person that you gave up everything for has abandoned you, and now you feel like you're left with nothing. Perhaps your career was everything to you. It was your entire life, but now you've retired and you feel a bit empty, and you feel like you're lacking purpose because everything was built on that job. Maybe earning money has been the thing that you've been getting out of bed for a long time, and now you've got all of that, but you still feel unfulfilled. And maybe this morning God is just prompting you in your heart. Maybe you're just getting a sense and a feeling that there is only really one true security in this life, and that is to be in relationship with the true and living God. And maybe you're in a place where you want to acknowledge that for the very first time this morning. And if that is you, we would absolutely love to pray with you. We would love to talk with you. But also if you want to acknowledge that for the 100th time today, because you know that in your life things have been slipping and priorities have been morphing in a different way, and you want to just recommit that God is the person you want to build your life on, then there's an opportunity to do that as well. I also really felt as I was preparing that there might be just one person here, maybe just one person who really understands what Belshazzar felt in that moment when the hand started writing on the wall. Where maybe you know that you're living in the pain of having built your life on the wrong foundation before. And now things are crumbling. Now things are falling apart. Perhaps there's a fear that's been stirred up that has even made you physically shake because the reality of it's setting in. And I believe if that is you this morning, God would say to you that he has not forgotten you. He has not let you go, even in your mistakes, even in the bad decisions, even in the faulty foundations. He still has got you in the palm of his hand, and his plans for your life are still to prosper you, and they're still to give you peace. And if that's you, we would love to pray with you, and we'd love to speak with you this morning as well. And I'd encourage you to take the opportunity. Whether you can resonate with any of that, or if there's anything else that you feel you just need prayer for this morning, there's going to be a team here who come to church on a Sunday desperate to come alongside people like you. That is what their heart is. And so don't miss that this morning. When we read through Daniel, one of the things that really stands out is, on the one hand, Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, they sinned in the same way. They both allowed themselves to become proud and to build their own empires and to think they were the kings of those empires. But the difference was Nebuchadnezzar humbled himself. He learned from the mistakes and he turned his eyes back towards the living God. Even though Belshazzar had that example before him, he didn't do the same thing. He was judged for not responding to what he had heard and adapting his life in the right way. And my prayer is we wouldn't make the same mistake this morning. But if God is challenging us, if he's prompting our hearts, that we would respond. life without compromise comes only in the form of a life with God as the firm cornerstone of our life. Amen.